Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. Well, this video is saying Salve atque vale, John McCririck. So, the United Kingdom's most instantly recognisable racing journalist has died. So, McCririck really was the face of British horse racing for 4 decades. So, he was ubiquitous at race grounds in Ireland and Great Britain, more in Great Britain of course, and he was Channel 4's chief turf correspondent through most of my lifetime. I only met him once, and that was at the Lord's match, the Harrow match, years ago. And he came in, and the boys, we all knew who he was. Though he was an old Harrovian, he preferred to sit with the Eton boys. I'm not quite sure why. But he was unmistakable. And I'm no fan of the GGs, but even I knew who he was since my early childhood. So even if you weren't keen on equestrianism, you might well be keen on him. And it was difficult not to be enthralled by him, by his antics. So there is some sort of book of British eccentrics. I'm not sure if he made it into that bumper book. And he held an appeal which reached well beyond horse racing fans. So those who didn't care for the turf, they still found him entertaining. So he was omnipresent, as I say, at race courses throughout the British Isles. He is best known for his millinery, even in this era where we mostly go hatless. He was born in 1940, of course. When he was growing up, you'd feel almost naked to go outside without a hat. Certainly at Eton, boys had to wear hats, well, obviously in the Second World War, but even in the 60s, they're going to London, they had to wear a hat. So the toppers only became optional in the Second World War because you had to carry a gas mask and there wasn't enough room to put your top hat down as well as your gas mask, blah, blah, blah. So now he often sported a deerstalker. Now that's, it was Basil Rathbone, the Sherlock Holmes actor in the United States, who made that very famous in the 1920s. It was really synonymous with the Sherlock Holmes role, even though it's not mentioned in any of these Sherlock Holmes stories. But he did wear all sorts of other headgear. What other hats did John McCririck wear? Almost like cowboy hats, obviously toppers, wearing a top hat at Royal Ascot, various other ones, 10-gallon hats, things like that. He was never without a hat, and other ones, I can't even think of the names of them, seem to be like Afghan hats. He liked to wear capes, sometimes Inverness capes, again, a la Sherlock Holmes. He was always visually arresting, often dressing in these vibrant colours, primary colours in some cases. He sported these sideboards, so his suit is sort of ginger hair, should I call them sideburns, I don't know, bugger grips, right down to the jawline, but always clean-shaven elsewhere. He sometimes wore old Harrovian ties or bow ties, occasionally even a striped blazer. So he would never be without his trademarks. He wore these Mr. Magoo glasses with huge chains down the front long after they had gone out of fashion. So these were his signature items, and his eccentricity was studied. It was a carefully cultivated image. So it's a bit like a sort of a racing tipster version of Boris Johnson. Anyway, he often wore plenty of bling, rings, necklaces, went in for wild gesticulations, and I can't quite do them. They're called tic-tacs or something like that. I don't get it, right? And if you're a racing person, you'd know what all this means. I don't quite understand it myself. So he was ebullient, he was rumbustious, he was irreverent, he was high octane. Well, there really was never a dull moment with him. So you couldn't accuse him of banality. And he managed to capture the exhilaration of horse racing, even for those who normally didn't care for it. It's deliciously ironic that he was so slow himself, being by middle age, hugely obese and just lumbering around. So his gait was not that one of a fleet-footed animal. So he married way back in 1971 to Jenny. They had no children, and he publicly and constantly referred to her as Booby, which many people thought to be denigrating. He refused to drive, so she had to do all sorts of things for him. And he larded his reportage with Harrovian argot. Like many public schools have their own micro lingo, and so he used expressions that would only be known by to people at that school, like tosh, meaning a bath. The others I don't know. He attracted such media attention that often be racegoers, and they were often tipsier than the tipster, behind him, pulling faces, doing impressions, dressing up as him, things like that. And he'd say, "Grow up, you fool," and things like that, which obviously was a trifle, how to put it, rich coming from him, since look at him, look at his antics, the way he was behaving, look at his get-up. So his raiment was decidedly anachronistic and intended to be visually arresting. Well, it worked. It was very eye-catching. He was unmissable at any of these race events. So he was seen to be an anti-hero for liberals in some of his attitudes, his professed sexism. What about his background? He's born in Surrey or Sussex, I don't really remember, into a well-to-do family. He went to prep school in Jersey just after the Second World War. It was a tax haven, so they were not short of pennies. He later went to Harrow School. Now, Harrow was often bracketed with Eton as being part of this duopoly, which dominated the realm for a few centuries. However, he vouchsafed that he was useless at cricket, often clashing with the authorities. Well, nothing changed there. They tried to turn him into a gentleman, well, you can judge how that worked out. And the only person who did worse at O-levels than him was John Major. So he said, with his typical disrespect for authority in the 1990s, when John Major was Prime Minister, John Major, the Prime Minister, who notoriously got only one O-level, who failed maths, who failed the test to be a bus conductor because he couldn't do the sums, and ended up as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Reassuring, isn't it? So Harrow was perceived to be a very upper-class school, and after he left it, he got the princely post of waiter. And he did other things. He worked as a bookmaker when off-course betting wasn't permitted, way back in the 50s, early 60s. So he wasn't a scholarly type at all. We can't all be academic. And these schools were far less demanding to get into. Harrow's actually not very academically difficult, even these days. Back then, you didn't need to be remotely scholarly. So they weren't all brainy boys. They didn't all go to university at all, let alone Oxford and Cambridge. But anyway, his métier was really reporting on horse racing and conveying some of that excitement to the general public, to those who weren't automatically enthralled by horse racing, but often they found him someone they were just glued to. He was undeniably entertaining and just effervescent with energy. So that was that. From 1981, he became Channel 4's main horse racing pundit. And remember, there were only 4 channels in the United Kingdom at the time. This was about 10 years before satellite. He was at just about every race meeting there was, chomping on cigars washed down by Olympian quantities of hard liquor. That's probably one of the reasons it's a good thing he didn't drive. So his opinion was sought on all sorts of issues, and he made sure that he was constantly in the press about other things, lifestyle interviews. But then he was got rid of, oh my goodness, in the early noughties, if memory serves, and he was hacked off. He's launched an age discrimination lawsuit against Channel 4, but no, he lost that case. He didn't fit with their new image. They had to make way for a new generation. I suppose he'd had his time in the sun. He'd had his 15 minutes of fame. Well, it's more like 30 years. So he strove to revive his flagging media career. He appeared on reality TV, and I can tell you that's the lowest of the low. I should know. And he was on a wife swap program. It was, you have no idea who you're going to swap with, and he was matched with Edwina Currie, the one who'd had an affair with Prime Minister John Major. Edwina Currie, the washed-up Conservative politician. So she's also superannuated, which is why she was so desperate to get back on telly. This Tory battle-axe feminist against him, well, it was going to be a clash of the titans, and it was. So he considered rather a termagant. He was also on Celebrity Big Brother. That, in case you don't know, that house is based on this George Orwell concept of total surveillance, where you're put in with people, you don't know who they're going to be, and for a few weeks and every few nights the public get to vote who's going to leave, and he did quite well, stayed there for quite some time. You wouldn't think he would appeal to the junior generation, but he did. And a lot of people would think he's a complete onanist for the way he dressed. He's an attention seeker. Was his perversity? Was he being such a contrarian? There was an element of that. But beneath that, people said he was very warm and deeply generous person in every sense. I can only take their word for it. I don't think there were that many people who hated him, actually. And it was one of the last iterations of Big Brother before it went off air in 2012. I kind of wanted to apply. I never did. I suppose I was worried people would see me picking my nose. So it was a desperate attempt to remain relevant, and it didn't really work. But in the last couple of years, he was withering away. I don't know what this wasting disease was. He was a half the man he used to be, almost literally, because he was known for being decently fat. This gave him gravitas, perhaps, What was he suffering from? Cancer, possibly. He lost his hair, that may be chemotherapy. He was shrunken, shriveled, looking increasingly drawn and frail. Poor chap, he visibly tremored in public. So he died just yesterday. Well, it's an awful pity. They don't make him like that anymore.